This is a Nissan GT-R Nismo, and it's truly insane. It'll do 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds. It'll hit a top speed of almost 200 miles an hour, and it's about as fast on a racetrack as a Porsche 918 Spider. It's also the most expensive Nissan ever. A new one of these starts at around $180,000. For a Nissan. That sounds absolutely crazy, but it starts to make sense when you really check it out. So today, I'm gonna do just that. I've borrowed this GT-R Nismo from CNC Motors here in Southern California. CNC has basically the coolest selection of exotic cars you will ever see in one place. An incredible inventory with seemingly no end of all the amazing stuff in their showroom. You can check out CNC by clicking on the links below. But even with all of those cars in mind, the GT-R Nismo is faster than almost all of them. So here's the deal. The GT-R was originally called the Skyline GT-R, and it was loved by car enthusiasts throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, but Nissan never sold the Skyline GT-R in North America. Nissan finally brought us the GT-R in 2009, and it came out with a 480 horsepower twin-turbo V6. That, of course, wasn't enough, and so in 2015, Nissan rolled out the Nismo model with a 600 horsepower version of the same engine, and that is this. And yes, it has a starting price of around $180,000, which makes this one of the most expensive Japanese cars in history. But when you look at the numbers, it starts to make sense. 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds, faster around a racetrack than most supercars. It may be one of the most expensive Japanese cars in history, but it's also one of the very best. And so today I'm going to show you around the GT-R Nismo, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the GT-R Nismo, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer. Now I'm going to start under the hood of the GT-R, where you can see the famous twin-turbo V6 that powers Godzilla, which is this car's nickname. A couple of interesting items under here. One is there's a little plaque that says hand built by, and then there's a little logo that says Takumi. Takumi is a term for like a master craftsman, someone very skilled at their trade. In this case, engine building, and the specific person who built this engine has their name on a plaque. We've seen this from AMG and from Aston Martin, a few other brands, but never really from the Japanese brands. It's a rarity, but the GT-R has it. I also like the fact that they've taken the time to write out carbon fiber composite under the hood. A lot of people just put carbon fiber under the hood. Nissan tells you that it's carbon fiber. And another really weird thing Nissan has chosen to write out up here under the hood, they've written premium midship. Now that's the name of the platform that the GT-R sits on, the Nissan's internal name for it. It's called premium midship because it's like a premium car and the engine is a little bit more in the middle. Regardless of why, I don't know why it's necessary to write that out there. It's not like you're like, I wonder what the name of my platform is. I should pop the hood and find out. But for some reason, they've chosen to do that. Next up, I want to focus on some of the changes that make the Nismo GT-R a Nismo high-performance version instead of the regular one. Now, there are quite a few changes under the skin. There's more power, better brakes, better suspension, but there's also some cosmetic changes that you can use to differentiate the Nismo GT-R from the regular one when you see them on the street. And the biggest and most obvious is up front. This car has a totally different front bumper and front grille than the regular GT-R. It looks more aggressive and more angry. It also has this sort of lower carbon fiber front splitter thing with the red trim around it to give this car sort of a meaner look up front. Now, that red trim is carried on down the entire side of the car. You can see they've included this red trim basically on the rocker panels all the way to the back. Also on the side of the car, the wheels are different. This car has special Nismo wheels that look cooler and probably way less than the wheels in the standard GT-R. And then around back, there are two major differences. differences. For one thing, the rear fascia and back is completely different. It also goes down lower, just like the one in front, and it has the same red trim around it and carbon fiber, just to sort of signify that it's the Nismo version. You also have a massive rear wing back there, much larger than the standard wing in the regular GTR. But despite all of those cosmetic changes to the outside, one stands out above all the rest. There's a little red decal strip they put on the mirrors. Don't forget that if you're making your GTR into a Nismo clone. You gotta have that decal strip, otherwise people will know that you're faking it. Next up, we move on to the GTR's trunk. You can open it by holding down a little button on the key fob, and then it pops open. You'll notice that the load floor is extremely high. Only basically the top part of the trunk opens up, which makes it a little difficult to get stuff in. Now, the trunk itself is not interesting at all. There's really nothing special about the trunk, but this is where I found this car's owner's manual. And there's one rather quirky item I found inside the owner's manual. On page 5-18, it gives you a little diagram for how not to hold the shifter, and then another one for how to hold the shifter. Now, at quick glance, they might look identical to you, but in that do not diagram, the person's pinky is at the bottom of the shifter. Now, I tried to hold it that way, and what happens is your pinky gets caught and it hurts, so don't do that. Maybe follow the instructions in the owner's manual. They must have had some issues with that, hence the little diagram. The other cool thing in the back of the GTR is the brake lights, the tail lights, the 4 circles. This has been a hallmark of the Skyline GTR, and now the GTR, for 30 years now, and I'm so glad that when they brought the GTR to the US, even though it was a totally new design, they kept these 4 circles. It is one of the signature pieces of tail light in the entire car industry, and few vehicles have such a distinctive tail light signature as the GTR. But while I love those taillights, a couple of items that I don't like. One is the door handle. The GTR, even though it has like supercar performance, generally looks kind of like a fairly normal car, but they decided to put on this supercar looking door handle. I get the sense that when this car came out, a lot of people were doing weird door handles, and Nissan was like, we're making a supercar, we have to do a weird door handle too. And so they did this. You have to push the back of it, and then it pops open the front part, and then you open it up. It's really not necessary, and frankly, a regular door handle would have been just fine for this car. Another item I don't really like is the key. Take a look at it. It looks just like a regular Nissan key, like you'd get an Altima that you rent at the Las Vegas airport, but it says GTR at the top instead of Nissan. And the key isn't the only regular cheap Nissan item that's used in this car. When you get inside, you might be surprised to discover that there are actually quite a few regular Nissan pieces carried over into the ultimate GTR. The power window switches, for example, are straight out of basically every other Nissan. Same with the power lock switch. Same with the turn signal stock and the windshield wiper stock. The mirror controls are also out of every other Nissan, and same with the heated seat controls. But with that said, there's also quite a few new and different items in this car that separate it from not only other Nissans, but just about any other car. For example, this car has the single best power seat control in the entire car industry. Now that may seem like strange praise, but look at this thing. It's just one circle on the side of the seat, and yet it does everything. You want to move the seat forward? Move the circle forward. You want to move the seat back? Well, then move the circle back. Pretty simple. Same for up and down. The backrest is also pretty simple. Just sort of twist the circle in the way you want to move the backrest, and then it moves in that direction. It is so intuitive and so perfect. All these other automakers waste all their time putting all these complex seat controls down there when really, you just need the Nissan GTR seat control circle. It's brilliant. Another interesting item inside this car that you won't see in other Nissans is the interior door handle. It isn't like a traditional door handle. Instead, it's sort of behind the grab handle, and you pull it up in order to open the door to let yourself out. Kind of an interesting quirk. Also, another interesting item you won't find in other Nissans is on the floor mat, and that would be the GTR emblem. And I say emblem because it doesn't say Nissan or GTR like embroidered in the floor mat like every other car. Instead, there's like a metal emblem in the floor mat, like the same one that you would find in the front grille of the car. I'm not sure why they chose to do that instead of just have it printed or stitched in there. Another unusual item in the GTR is this set of 3 switches in the center control stack just below the climate controls. The switches are kind of strange. The one on the right has a wheel on it. That turns off traction control and stability control. You push it up to R, and then traction control and stability control are off. The one in the middle is a little bit more obvious. It has a picture of a shock absorber. That is to turn the suspension into sport mode if you put it in R, or comfort if you put it in comfort. The one on the left is the weirdest though. It has a picture of like a differential. Initially I was like, does this thing engage rear wheel drive and disengage all wheel drive? Actually, all that does is it puts the transmission in like sport mode, and it readies launch control if you put it in R, whereas if you press save for some reason, it goes back into transmission comfort mode. And those are those three switches. Another interesting item that's a little strange in the middle is the gear lever. Not only is it kind of short and stubby, but it has sort of a weird pattern. P and R are in a line, then you move it over for neutral, and then down for drive. You have A and M, automatic and manual. This obviously is also very different from the gear levers in other Nissan models. Now, next up, a couple of interesting items in the gauge cluster. One is the fact that you can set a shift alert. So basically you're driving around in manual mode, it'll beep to let you know it's time to upshift. Interestingly, you can set this alert as low as 3,000 RPM and in 100 RPM increments from there, or you can skip to higher RPMs. You can also leave the shift alert in auto, and then the car will alert you when it thinks that it's time to shift, which frankly is probably a little bit smarter. That's not all that unusual, a shift alert that's configurable. I've seen that in a few other cars. One thing I haven't seen in other cars is a timer. You can go into the gauge cluster and set a timer for like a half hour or an hour and a half, all the way up to 6 hours. Like the GTR is an oven and you're setting a timer. It's one of the strangest things I've seen, and I don't remember seeing it in any other car, but if you want, you can set a timer that counts down, and I guess it beeps to let you know that it's done, and then you have to do something. Now, next up we move on to the center screen, and to start, it just has an unbelievable array of gauges and indicators of what the car is doing. Now, you start on the first screen and you see some usual stuff: oil pressure, oil temperature, boost gauge. None of that stuff is especially unusual, but there are 5 screens of this, and you have some incredible stuff in here. For example, you have precise accelerator pedal percentage. How much are you pushing down the gas pedal? You have the same for the brake pedal. You have braking G-forces, and then you have other screens, all of which show various different gauges for anything that you might want to see. This could be very useful if you're on the track. This car even has a gauge that shows fuel flow, how much fuel is getting into the motor. I have never seen that in any other car, no matter how many different gauges it has. One other important item to note about those gauges in the screen is that they're all configurable. So you have 5 different pages of gauges, and you can edit any of them. You can change which gauges are displayed on which pages, so that you always know, for example, page 5 is all the transmission information, page 4 is accelerator information, or whatever. You can swap them all out, which makes it even more impressive. Now, next up, there are a couple of other interesting items in the infotainment screen, all of which are related to navigation settings. First off, I'm going to start with navigation guidance volume. When you turn that up or down, it's kind of amusing, and here's why.
Softer, 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 louder, louder, softer, softer.
Ah yes, softer, softer, louder, louder. And if that wasn't strange enough, how about this? You can change the map color. Something, all right, great, the map color, I can change it to purple or green. How wonderful. No. You can change it between cool and warm. You want your map to be cool? You want it to be warm. You get in one day, it's too cool, the map, change it to warm. That's something you can do in your GTR. And finally, we must get into the GTR's back seats. Yes, the GTR somehow has back seats. They're incredibly small. You fold the front seat forward, then you use the brilliant front seat circle to move it as far forward as possible, and eventually it stops. And when it does stop, it is still nowhere near enough room for any reasonable person to get inside. Nonetheless, I will get inside. It is just incredibly tight back here. I think this might be the tightest, smallest, most ridiculous back seat in the entire car industry. And when I sit back and put the seat back in place, there's absolutely no room for any part of my body. And it's not just that there's no leg room. The real problem is headroom. You can see that the car kind of comes down like this. It's not really conducive to any rear headroom for any reasonable adult. Now, Nissan clearly knew this, because They didn't put any frills in these back seats. There's no adjustability. There isn't even climate vents back here. Basically, all you have in the back seats of this car are 2 seat belts, 1 cup holder for some reason, and lots of suffering. And so those are the quirks and features of the Nissan GT-R Nismo. Now it's time to get it out on the road and drive the ultimate Japanese sports car. All right, driving the GT-R Nismo. The transmission in this car has always felt very mechanical. It gives kind of a robust, like confident feeling to it because you feel like it really is overbuilt. But it's not anywhere near as smooth as PDK or the transmissions in cars like that. That's kind of the intent though. At low speeds, the car itself just kind of feels very mechanical. You can hear a lot of stuff going on. You can feel a lot of stuff. It clunks. And some people complain about that, but I think that's kind of a hallmark of the GT-R. This is not the refined supercar that a Ferrari or a Lamborghini is. It's just about the brute force and the power. There is a lot of power. Man, it is so incredibly fast. One of the fastest cars on the road today. You can feel it. Even there, from a highway speed already going highway speed, you drop down to the correct rear gear and you floor it, and it feels just insanely fast, like very few other cars feel. Now, then you go over the highway, the little lane marker bumps, and it's punishing. I mean, this is brutal. This car is about speed and very little else. The intent was not to make it a luxury car or, oh, it also has, no, this car is for speed, 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 and not just straight line speed. Even just a half stab on the throttle, you're faster than anybody else on the road. I mean, it's so fast. It's brutal in every way. The ride is brutal, and maybe you can kind of see the camera shaking a little bit, but it's not just the ride. The steering feel is just fantastic. This is a hallmark of the GT-R. Incredibly just precise. It's so good. Again, the design is intended for, precision is just so good. It feels about as precise as you can get without being a mid-engine car. There's very little body roll. The steering is linear. It goes exactly where you put it. Really, really impressive. Yeah, the steering is just amazing. The car just feels like it has grip forever and ever and ever. Which is true, which is probably because it does. I mean, this car is so capable of so much. The ride is just radically bumpy. It's just something you have to tolerate. But no one buys this car on accident. No one buys this car and then complains about the ride quality. Everybody who gets one of these is like, yeah, that's what I signed up for because I wanted the best. And this is that. It's amazing, the transmission buckles and stuff, and you can feel it, and that's just sort of operating as designed. That's how it is. But, you know, that's a problem at low speeds when you're slowing down for intersections and red lights. If you're driving this car where it was intended to be driven on the racetrack, the transmission feels not only great, but really, really fast. It's very quick shifting. Even at 40 miles an hour, it feels very quick. It's only at low speeds where it starts to feel clunky, and Nissan would say, well, you're missing the point of the car. I mean, that's who cares? And so that's the Nissan GT-R Nismo. Everyone talks about how the 1990s were the heyday for the Japanese sports car. You had the Mitsubishi 3000 GT, you had the Supra, the Nissan 300ZX, the Mazda RX-7, but what about now? These days we have the Subaru STI, we have the Acura NSX, the Supra is coming back, and then we have this. Basically the most ultimate Japanese sports car in history. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the GT-R Nismo is fine, but that's about it. This has never been a beautiful car, or even attempted to be a beautiful car. It's functional and brutal, and the looks are more something you put up with than love, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds gives it a 10 out of 10. Handling, it's incredible at the limit with tons of grip and amazing precision, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Fun factor is strong, it's a joy to drive, but also a bit too rough around the edges to reach the highest echelon, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Cool factor is okay. This car is cool to enthusiasts, but the general public is largely unmoved, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 40 out of 50, which is a big number. Next up onto the daily categories and features. The GT-R is missing a lot of modern tech, but it has some stuff that basically nobody else does with those endless screens of gauges. It gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort is rough. It has power seats and heated seats and good climate control, but the ride itself is harsh, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Quality is fine, these are robust cars, but the interior isn't exactly beautiful and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is surprisingly good. The rear seats are small, but they exist, which is more than you can say for most similar cars, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value, and this is a tough one. The regular GTR already offers supercar-beating performance for around 100 grand, and I personally think it's hard to justify another 75 grand just to be a little better at the limit with the Nismo model. It gets only a 5 out of 10 for a total daily score of 25 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 65 out of 100, and here's where it stacks up against other cars from this era and price point. Some people are going to bitterly complain, how could the GTR possibly lose to the new NSX? But the GTR Nismo's biggest issue is that value score. I actually think the regular GTR is probably a better all-around car, offering almost an identical experience for basically 60% of the price.